If you ever get offered a job on an offshore oil rig and they tell you you'll be the only one there, don't take it. No matter how much they're paying you, it's not worth it. Trust me, I'm speaking from experience, and if you're hearing this, there's a good chance I didn't make it back. Before we dive into what happened, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon. Because this story isn't just a warning, it's the reason no one talks about what's buried beneath the sea. When they called me about the job, it sounded perfect. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I preferred it. Solitude wasn't a curse for me, it was a relief. Crowded rooms made me uneasy, and I wasn't one for small talk or forced smiles. Give me a quiet place, a good wrench, and a checklist, and I was just fine. The company was vague on the details. "You'll be maintaining an offshore rig for us," the recruiter said. "It's fully automated, so you'll mostly be performing system checks, maybe fixing a valve here or there. Short job, 10 days max, pays excellent." He wasn't lying about the pay. $20,000 for a week and a half of work. I could clear my debts, maybe buy a truck that didn't rattle like an old man coughing. The catch? I'd be alone on the rig. When I asked why, the recruiter gave a practiced answer. "Repairs made it uninhabitable for the crew, but we need a live body to check the systems before they come back online." Standard procedure. I should have asked more questions. Should have said no, but I didn't. My name's David Carlisle, by the way. 34 years old, mechanic by trade, loner by choice. I've worked in steel mills, auto plants, and oil fields. Grease-stained hands are the only part of me that feels honest, and I don't like to overthink much else. Life's simpler that way. People, they're messy. I don't hate anyone. I just don't see the point of getting close. It's why I've never been married, why I don't talk to my family anymore. If I had to describe myself in one word, it'd be functional. I get the job done, and I move on. The helicopter dropped me off just after dawn. The sun barely touched the horizon, casting a rusty glow over the ocean. The rig loomed ahead, its towering steel framework rising like a skeleton out of the water. I'd seen oil rigs before, but this one felt off, too still, too empty. The chopper pilot didn't say much as we approached. I noticed the way he gripped the controls a little tighter than usual, his eyes fixed on the rig like it might reach up and grab us. "You'll be good here?" he asked as we landed. I nodded. "I've been alone before." He didn't smile. "Radio if you need us." And then he was gone, the blades whipping the air until the chopper disappeared into the distance. The noise faded and silence swallowed everything. For the first time, I felt it. What they hadn't warned me about. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but full, like something's listening. I stood on the deck, staring out at the water. The horizon stretched in every direction, endless and indifferent. No land, no boats, nothing but the groaning of the rig's steel beams as they shifted in the wind. Inside the rig was worse. The main deck was a maze of narrow corridors, control rooms, and common spaces that felt abandoned mid-breath. It didn't look old or broken. It just looked left. In the mess hall, I found plates still on the tables, as though the crew had stepped away for a smoke break and never came back. A half-empty coffee cup sat on the counter, its stain dried solid. I ran my finger through the dust on one of the tables. This place had been empty for longer than 10 days. I kept moving. The bunks were the same, personal items scattered like the owners might return any minute. A book open on a pillow, dog-eared halfway through. A shaving kit lying on the sink. On one bunk, a Polaroid photo of 3 men, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning for the camera. Someone had written on the bottom in marker, "Last shift, boys, almost home." I stared at that photo for a long time. After dropping my bag in one of the empty bunks, I started my first task, checking the rig's electrical systems. Most of the panels were automated, reporting green lights across the board. Routine work. The company wasn't lying about the rig being functional. Everything looked fine, but as I moved from room to room, a nagging feeling crawled in the back of my mind. Like I wasn't supposed to be here. Like I'd walked into someone else's home uninvited. By the time I reached the generator room, that feeling had sunk into my chest. The air was stale and thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in months. A small puddle of oil shimmered on the ground, perfectly still. I looked around. There was no leak. Then I saw them. Boot prints in the oil. At first, I figured they were mine. I'd walked through the puddle, right? But the prints led toward me, Not away. Fresh ones. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. I hadn't heard anyone else on the rig. No engines, no footsteps, no voices. I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. Just the hollow, flickering light. By the time night came, I'd convinced myself the boot prints were old, left over from the last crew. The oil settled weird. Nothing to worry about. I repeated those thoughts like a mantra as I sat in the control room, eating from a can of chili I'd brought with me. Outside the window, the ocean was black. I could barely make out the edge of the deck under the rig's floodlights, which flickered every few seconds like they were struggling to stay awake. I turned on the radio, hoping to reach the mainland, just to hear another voice. A crackle of static came through. "This is Carlisle, Rig 7. Come in, requesting confirmation." Nothing. I adjusted the dial. "Mainland, do you read?" "Rig 7 systems operational, requesting contact." Still nothing. But then, buried under the static, I thought I heard something. Not a voice, not at first. More like the sound of breathing. I leaned closer to the speaker, holding my breath so I wouldn't confuse it with my own. A faint whisper slipped through the static. "Carlisle." I slammed the radio off, my hands shaking. Sleep didn't come easy. The bunks felt too small, the air too close. Every groan of the rig echoed through the metal, turning into a sound I couldn't quite place. Around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps above me, like someone pacing on the upper deck. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The steps stopped, and for a moment I thought it was just the rig settling. Then they started again, slow and steady, moving toward the stairwell. My throat went dry. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, flicking it on as I stepped into the hallway. The beam cut through the dark, reflecting off the metal walls. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small against the steel. No answer. I climbed the stairs to the upper deck, the flashlight shaking in my hand. When I reached the top, I swept the light across the platform. Empty. And then, just at the edge of the beam, I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the deck, silhouetted against the night sky. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just stood there, staring at me, though I couldn't see its face. The flashlight flickered. I smacked it against my palm, and the beam sputtered back on. When I looked up, the figure was gone. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. But I didn't sleep again that night. I didn't leave the bunk the next morning until the first rays of sunlight broke through the porthole window. I'd spent most of the night sitting upright on the bed, flashlight in hand, eyes fixed on the doorway. When you're alone in a place like that, truly alone, you start questioning every sound, every shadow. I kept telling myself what I'd seen couldn't be real. A trick of the light. Exhaustion. Maybe the figure I'd seen was an old piece of machinery. That made sense, right? It had to. The alternative, that someone else was on the rig with me, wasn't something I wanted to consider. I threw myself into work that morning, determined to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. That's what I do best. Put my head down and push forward. The rig was massive, and the tasks the company left me were straightforward. First up, system diagnostics. The control room was on the main deck, surrounded by consoles filled with blinking lights and displays that monitored the rig's functions. Most of the readings were steady. Pressure valves were stable, generator output was fine, and the oil drilling equipment was quiet. Too quiet. That was the first thing that struck me. A rig like this should have had some activity. Even with the drilling paused, the equipment wasn't supposed to sit idle. Systems needed to be tested, prepped for when operations restarted. But instead, everything seemed eerily dormant, like the rig itself was holding its breath. I sat down at one of the control panels and began running diagnostics. Green lights blinked across the board. No errors, no malfunctions. On paper, everything was perfect, and yet something didn't feel right. I noticed the generator logs first. A strange pattern. Every night for the past 3 weeks, there had been short power surges, only for a few seconds, but enough to register on the system. It wasn't random either. The surges happened at almost the same time every night. 3:13 a.m. I frowned, double-checking the readings. It didn't make sense. If the rig had been unoccupied for weeks, there shouldn't have been any surges at all. I decided to contact the mainland again, It wasn't just the strange readings. I needed to hear another human voice. I picked up the radio and switched it on. Rig 7 to mainland operations. Come in. This is Carlisle, reporting in. Static. I turned the dial, trying to adjust the frequency. Mainland, this is Rig 7. Do you read me? The static crackled, and for a moment, I thought I heard something beneath it. A faint murmur. My own name. Carlisle. I froze. I leaned closer, gripping the mic so tightly my knuckles turned white. Who's there? Who is this? The static deepened, growing louder until it turned into a low, guttural hum. It was a sound that made my skin crawl, like a voice that wasn't quite a voice. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noise cut off. The radio went dead. I sat back in the chair, cold sweat dripping down my neck. My hands were trembling. Someone, or something, was trying to reach me. I spent the afternoon walking the rig, searching for answers. I told myself it was to clear my head, but really, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rig was a labyrinth of catwalks, stairwells, and steel doors. I checked every corner, every room, looking for any sign of another person. But there was no one. Just the occasional groan of metal shifting in the wind and the rhythmic hum of the generators below deck. And yet, things didn't add up. In the engine room, I found a panel that had been left open. A bundle of wires had been torn free, sparking faintly. I hadn't touched that panel before, and according to the logs, no one else had been here in weeks. In the mess hall, I noticed something else. The half-empty coffee cup I'd seen the day before was gone. At first, I thought maybe I'd misremembered, but then I noticed a smear of dried coffee on the counter where the cup had been. Someone, or something, had moved it. I felt like I was losing my mind. Late in the day, while exploring the lower levels, I found a door I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway, rusted over and marked with peeling yellow paint. The word "restricted" was stenciled across the front. I pushed against the handle, and to my surprise, the door creaked open. A metal stairwell led downward, disappearing into darkness. I hesitated at the top, shining my flashlight down the steps. Cold air wafted up, carrying with it the faint smell of oil and something else. Something sharp and metallic, like blood. I didn't want to go down. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away. But curiosity got the better of me. I gripped the flashlight tighter and started down the stairs, the sound of my boots echoing off the walls. The stairwell led to a lower deck that wasn't on any of the schematics I'd seen. The walls were covered in grime, the air thick and humid. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping water onto the rusted floor. And then I saw it, a series of rooms, each one filled with strange equipment. Machines I didn't recognize. Gauges and tubes that pulsed faintly, like they were alive. I stopped at the doorway of one of the rooms. There was something scrawled on the far wall in thick black paint. "It's awake. Don't let it hear you." My blood ran cold. I backed out of the room, my flashlight flickering as I turned toward the stairwell. I felt something behind me, something watching. I didn't dare turn around. I sprinted back up the stairs, my boots pounding against the metal steps. The door at the top slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the hallway like a gunshot. I stood there, panting, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever was down there, I didn't want to know. By the time night fell, I was on edge. Every sound set me off. The wind rattling a loose panel, the hum of the generators, the faint creak of the rig shifting on its supports. I sat in the control room with the flashlight beside me, refusing to turn off the lights. I couldn't stop thinking about that word, awake. What did it mean? What had the previous crew disturbed? And why had no one told me? The clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight, each second dragging on longer than the last. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined everything, that the boot prints, the radio, and the message on the wall were all just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, at 3:13 a.m., the lights flickered. I stared at the ceiling as the room plunged into darkness for a split second before the lights flared back on. My radio crackled, static pouring from the speaker. And then I heard it. A voice, faint and distorted. It was saying something over and over again. "Come down, come down, come down." I grabbed the radio and slammed it off, but the voice didn't stop. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from outside. I turned toward the window. Through the glass, I could see the upper deck bathed in pale moonlight. And there, standing at the far end of the platform, was the figure I'd seen the night before. Only this time, it wasn't still. It was walking toward the control room, slow, deliberate. Its shadow stretched across the deck, growing longer and longer as it approached. And then it stopped. Right outside the window, I couldn't see its face, just the silhouette of a man, tall and thin, head tilted slightly to one side. And then it knocked, 3 slow, deliberate taps on the glass. I stumbled back, my chest heaving as I scrambled for the flashlight. When I shined the beam toward the window, the figure was gone. But on the glass, smeared in what looked like oil, were the words, "Come down." The rest of the night was a blur. I don't remember how long I sat there, frozen in the control room, staring at the words smeared on the glass, "Come down." The oil-black letters seemed to pulse under the flickering light, as though they were alive. I couldn't bring myself to wipe them away. At some point, the power steadied, and the humming of the rig returned to normal. I was tempted to lock myself in the bunk room, bury my head under the covers like a child, and wait for the sun to rise. But whatever was happening, whatever this place was, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. The rig wasn't just a decaying relic in the middle of the ocean. Something was happening here, something that was getting worse, and I was at the center of it. "Come down." The words gnawed at me. Who or what had written that? I kept picturing the figure on the platform, that tall, thin shadow standing under the moonlight, its head tilted, its movements deliberate. It had seen me. I knew it had, and now it was calling me. I tried to think rationally. Maybe there was someone else on this rig, another worker, some unaccounted-for crew member who'd been here before me, someone left behind, someone deranged. It was an idea I could hold on to, something to make sense of all this. But even as I thought it, I didn't believe it. That thing I saw wasn't human. I spent the early hours of the morning pacing the rig, flashlight in hand, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me from just out of sight. My mind kept drifting back to the hidden passage, the door marked restricted. Whatever was happening on this rig, it started down there. And if I didn't figure out what it was, I wouldn't make it through another night. I didn't want to go back down, but at the same time, I felt like I didn't have a choice. The door in my mind might as well have been a black hole, pulling me closer with every step I took. By mid-morning, I found myself standing at the top of the stairwell again. I hesitated, the flashlight trembling in my hand. "Pull it together," I muttered to myself. "In and out. Just look around, get some answers, and come back up." The smell of rust and oil hit me as soon as I started descending. The stairwell was darker this time, the overhead light bulbs buzzing faintly before flickering out. I shined my flashlight at the bottom and stepped onto the lower deck. The air was even thicker than before, like it was pressing in on me. My footsteps echoed, and the sound seemed to chase me down the corridor. The strange equipment I'd found the day before was still there. Machines covered in grime and dust. Tubes that hissed faintly, as if they were breathing. I kept moving, sweeping the flashlight across the walls. Then I found something I'd missed the first time. At the far end of the corridor, there was another door. Unlike the rest, it wasn't rusted shut or peeling with age. It was pristine, gleaming, almost, like it had been installed recently. I stepped closer, and that's when I noticed it. A faint vibration in the floor beneath me. I crouched, placing my hand on the metal grating. The vibration wasn't coming from the machinery. It was coming from below. Something deep inside the rig was moving. I gripped the door handle and hesitated. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, to run back to the control room and radio for help again. But I knew the radio wouldn't work. Not out here, not anymore. I pushed the door open. It led to a massive chamber, far larger than I expected. The flashlight beam barely cut through the darkness, but I could see enough. The walls were lined with strange markings, symbols carved deep into the steel. Some looked geometric, others more organic, like something alive had scratched them there. In the center of the room was a pit. It was enormous, at least 30 feet across, perfectly circular and surrounded by more of those strange symbols. I stepped closer, peering into the darkness. My flashlight couldn't reach the bottom. I tossed a small bolt I'd found on the floor over the edge, counting the seconds until I heard it hit. But there was no sound, it just kept falling. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. What the hell was this? Why would a drilling rig have a chamber like this? It was like I was standing above a well that stretched into the earth itself. Then the whispering started. It was faint at first, so quiet I almost thought it was the wind. But as I stood there, frozen in place, the whispers grew louder. A chorus of voices. Not human voices. The sounds were layered, overlapping and reverberating, as if they were coming from the pit. I turned to leave, but then something caught my eye. On the far wall, half hidden by shadows, there was a console. It looked newer than the rest of the equipment, its surface covered in switches and buttons. A small screen flickered faintly, displaying a single word: activate. I stepped closer, my breath fogging in the cold air. The console hummed softly, vibrating under my touch. My mind was screaming at me not to touch it, but something else, something stronger, pulled me in. I reached out and flipped the switch. The pit rumbled. The sound started as a low groan, deep and guttural, like the earth itself was exhaling. The ground beneath me began to shake. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The whispers turned into screams. Thousands of voices shrieking at once, filling the chamber with deafening noise. I clamped my hands over my ears, my flashlight rolling across the floor. And then I heard it. A sound that froze me to the spot. A heartbeat. It was slow and steady, a rhythmic thump, 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 pounding through the chamber. I felt it in my chest, in my bones. The pit wasn't just deep, it was alive. I grabbed the flashlight and bolted for the door, the heartbeat growing louder with every step. The walls groaned, and I could hear something rising behind me, something massive. I didn't dare look back. I sprinted up the stairs 2 at a time, my boots slipping on the metal. The door at the top was still open, and I threw myself through it, slamming it shut behind me. The noise stopped. The rig was silent again. I slumped against the door, my chest heaving. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the rig itself was holding its breath. I staggered back to the control room, locking the door behind me. I sat in the chair, staring blankly at the blinking lights on the consoles. I'd woken something up. I knew that now. The pit, the heartbeat, the voices, it had all been buried down there for a reason, and I'd let it out. I glanced at the window. The smeared words, "Come down," were still there. But this time, there was something else, a single handprint. It was pressed against the glass, large and dark, as if whoever or whatever had left it was still standing outside. I didn't move. I couldn't. Then slowly, the handprint slid downward, leaving a streak of oil as it disappeared from view. I sat there for hours, waiting for the sun to rise, but it never did. The sky outside stayed dark, the clouds thick and unmoving. I was trapped on that rig, alone in the middle of the ocean. And whatever was down there, whatever I'd woken up, it was coming for me. All right, if you made it this far, you know things are only getting creepier. If you want to see what happens next and find out if I make it out of this rig, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what comes next. Drop a comment below with your theories and share this with someone who loves a good horror story. Trust me, they'll thank you later. Until next time, stay safe. And remember, you never really know what's lurking out there in the dark.